Winter 1946. Berlin, Potsdamer Platz. The temperature hovers at -12 degrees Celsius. Snow falls through the skeletal remains of what was once Europe's busiest intersection, covering rubble that used to be the Grand Hotel Esplanade, the Haus Vaterland Entertainment Palace, the Scorehouse department store. 4 million cubic meters of debris. The silence is broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ash. An elderly woman emerges from a basement doorway, her breath crystallizing in the air. She wears 3 layers of clothing, none of them adequate. In her gloved hands, wrapped carefully in newspaper from October 1938, the last time her family celebrated anything, she carries a Meissen porcelain figurine. Shepherdess with lamb. Circa 1880. Her grandmother's wedding gift. Market value in 1938, 450 Reichsmarks, equivalent to 2 months' wages for a skilled worker. She walks 17 blocks, past the burnout Reichstag, past the Soviet checkpoint where soldiers stamp their feet against the cold, to a marketplace that exists in defiance of every occupation law. Here, in the shadow of the Brandenburg Gate, the real economy of defeated Germany conducts its business. She approaches a man wearing a U.S. Army overcoat, probably looted, possibly traded. He doesn't look at the figurine closely. He's seen hundreds like it. Rosenthal, Meissen, Nymphenburg, the finest porcelain workshops in Europe, reduced to barter currency. He reaches into his pocket and removes a single carton of Lucky Strike cigarettes. 20 packs. 200 cigarettes. Current black market value, 1,800 Reichsmarks, enough to buy a month's worth of bread on the black market, if you can find bread. She doesn't negotiate. The exchange takes 11 seconds. She walks away clutching the carton like a life preserver, because that's exactly what it is. The cigarettes won't be smoked, they'll be traded for potatoes, for coal, for a bicycle inner tube, for the prescription medicine her grandson needs. In the new Germany, tobacco is currency more reliable than any government could print. The man with the overcoat places the figurine in a rucksack already containing a gold wedding band, 14 grams, 2 silver candlesticks, probably Jewish, he doesn't ask, a Wehrmacht officer's Luger pistol, a complete set of Goethe's works, leather-bound, 1890 edition, and a violin, maker unknown, probably worth more than everything else combined. By nightfall, he'll have 40 cigarette cartons converted into objects that German families spent generations accumulating. By next week, those cartons will be on a train to Hamburg, then a ship to New York, where the figurine will sell in an antique shop for $85, the equivalent of 340 Reichsmarks at the official exchange rate, or 850 Reichsmarks black market rate. The mathematics of collapse were being written in tobacco and desperation. What reduced a civilized European nation to using cigarettes as currency wasn't simply military defeat. It was the systematic destruction of every mechanism that makes modern society function: production, distribution, trust, law, and the fundamental belief that tomorrow will resemble today. This is the story of how Germany's economic apocalypse transformed American cigarettes into the most stable currency in Europe, and how that transformation revealed the precise machinery by which a society disintegrates. The answer lies not in ideology or politics, but in calories, coal, and the collapse of human dignity, measured in tobacco leaves wrapped in paper. The woman who traded her grandmother's Meissen figurine for cigarettes wasn't irrational. She was responding to mathematics that destroyed the German economy more thoroughly than Allied bombs destroyed German cities. To understand why she chose tobacco over currency requires understanding what happened to the Reichsmark between May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, and June 20, 1948, when the Deutsche Mark replaced it. This 37-month period witnessed the complete disintegration of a monetary system, a collapse so total that money itself became worthless paper while cigarettes became the most trusted store of value in Central Europe. The execution began with numbers that made economic recovery impossible. In December 1944, 73 billion Reichsmarks circulated through the German economy. By May 1945, that figure reached 300 billion, a 311% increase in 5 months. The Reichsbank printing presses, many relocated to caves and abandoned mines to escape Allied bombing, ran continuously during the war's final months. The Nazi government printed currency to pay for a war it was losing, flooding Germany with paper that represented nothing except desperation. When the shooting stopped, the Allied occupation forces inherited this monetary catastrophe. They had defeated Germany's army. They had not defeated its inflation. The official exchange rate in 1945 stood at 10 Reichsmarks to $1 American. The occupation authorities, the Allied Control Council, established this rate and enforced it with military law. Any soldier caught trading currency at unofficial rates faced court-martial. Any German caught operating outside official channels faced imprisonment. The official rate was fantasy. On the streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich, reality operated differently. By autumn 1945, the black market exchange rate reached 400 Reichsmarks to $1. The currency that officially held value held none in practice. Germans who received wages in Reichsmarks discovered their monthly earnings couldn't purchase a week's food on the black market, where actual goods changed hands. Then the cigarette standard emerged, and the Reichsmark's execution became complete. A single American cigarette, one Lucky Strike or Chesterfield, traded for 6 to 12 Reichsmarks depending on the city and month. This seemingly arbitrary figure represented something the Reichsmark could never reclaim: actual purchasing power. That cigarette could be traded again, for bread or potatoes or coal. The Reichsmark could be traded for nothing except more worthless paper. The price of bread measured the collapse with precision that economic theory couldn't obscure. In January 1945, official ration bread cost 32 pfennigs per kilogram. This was the legal price, enforced by remaining Nazi authorities, then by occupation forces. The ration system itself was collapsing. There wasn't enough bread to fulfill rations, but the official price remained fixed, a number on paper representing stability that no longer existed. By December 1946, black market bread cost 60 to 80 Reichsmarks per kilogram. The same loaf. The same weight. 250 times more expensive in 23 months. Or, measured in cigarettes, 5 to 6 cigarettes per kilogram. Germans quickly learned which measurement system mattered. Factory workers watched their wages become absurdity. The average monthly wage for a factory worker in 1946 was 180 Reichsmarks, paid officially, recorded in employment ledgers, taxed by occupation authorities. With that wage, at official prices, a worker could theoretically purchase goods that didn't exist at those prices. At black market prices, those 180 Reichsmarks purchased approximately 2.5 kilograms of bread. Enough for 2 weeks if you ate nothing else. 40 cigarettes, which an American soldier received in his weekly ration and could purchase at the post exchange for $2, could purchase 50 kilograms of bread on the black market. The monthly wage of a German factory worker, who had survived the war, who reported to work daily, who contributed to reconstruction, couldn't match the purchasing power of $2 worth of American tobacco. This wasn't inflation in the traditional sense. This was currency death. The Reichsmark still existed. Employers still paid wages with it. The occupation authorities still required taxes paid in it. It circulated, changed hands, filled wallets and purses. But it had lost the essential characteristic that makes paper into money: belief. Germans no longer believed Reichsmarks represented value. They believed in cigarettes, in butter, in coal, in physical objects that could sustain life or be traded for such objects. The Allied occupation authorities watched this parallel economy flourish and proved unable to stop it. Military law prohibited black market trading. Thousands of Germans were arrested, fined, imprisoned. It changed nothing. When the official economy offers starvation and the illegal economy offers survival, humans choose survival. Every time. Without exception. By late 1947, the cigarette economy had achieved complete dominance. Germans calculated prices in cigarettes, not Reichsmarks. How many cigarettes? Became the question asked in every transaction that mattered. The Reichsmark became a ghost currency, present but powerless, a reminder of the nation that no longer existed. The final blow came not from market forces but from government decree. June 20, 1948. Currency reform. Every German citizen in the Western occupation zones received 40 Deutsche Marks in exchange for 40 Reichsmarks. A one-to-one conversion, seemingly fair. For all other Reichsmark holdings, bank accounts, bonds, insurance policies, pensions, the conversion rate was 100 Reichsmarks to 6.5 Deutsche Marks. 93.5% of paper wealth destroyed by law in a single weekend. Savings accounts that held 10,000 Reichsmarks woke up Monday morning holding 650 Deutsche Marks. Life insurance policies accumulated over decades became worthless. Government bonds purchased to fund the Reich became scrap paper. The Reichsmark didn't fade away. It was executed, deliberately, by the same Allied authorities who had tried unsuccessfully to preserve it. The Germans who had already converted their wealth to cigarettes, to heirlooms, to physical goods, survived currency reform with assets intact. Those who had trusted in paper wealth, who had believed the Reichsmark would recover, who had followed official guidance and kept money in banks, lost everything. The Meissen figurine traded for cigarettes in winter 1946 represented not desperation but cold calculation. That grandmother's porcelain, converted to tobacco, could be traded for food throughout the cigarette economy years, then converted to Deutsche Marks when real currency returned. The figurine kept in a cabinet as family heritage would have survived, beautiful and worthless, while its owner starved. The mathematics of survival had spoken. In the contest between paper and tobacco, between official decree and black market reality, between government promises and physical hunger, tobacco won. The Reichsmark was executed not on the day currency reform became law, but on the day Germans learned that American cigarettes bought bread while German currency bought nothing. The woman at Potsdamer Platz with her carton of Lucky Strikes understood what economists and occupation authorities failed to grasp. Money is whatever people believe it is, and belief cannot be legislated by military government. It must be earned. The Reichsmark had lost that belief. The cigarette had gained it. The currency was dead. The trading had just begun. Understanding why cigarettes became currency requires understanding what Germans were actually buying with them, and the answer measured exactly 1,550 calories per day in the British zone, 1,040 in the French zone, barely enough to sustain life, never enough to sustain hope. The cigarette economy existed because the food economy had collapsed. Germans weren't trading Meissen porcelain and gold wedding bands for luxury. They were trading accumulated wealth for survival measured in potatoes, in loaves of bread, in grams of fat that meant the difference between waking up tomorrow and not waking up at all. The occupation authorities established official ration allocations. The numbers reveal why those rations forced Germans into black markets where cigarettes ruled. Winter 1946 to 1947. The British zone, covering northwestern Germany including Hamburg and the Ruhr industrial region, allocated 1,550 calories per person daily. The American zone, covering southern Germany including Bavaria and Frankfurt, allocated 1,330 calories. The French zone, covering southwestern Germany along the Rhine, allocated 1,040 calories. The Soviet zone in eastern Germany allocated 1,090 calories. These figures represent official rations, the food Germans could purchase legally with ration cards and Reichsmarks at controlled prices. The numbers assume all allocated food actually reached distribution points. Often it didn't. For context, the human body requires approximately 2,000 calories daily for basic metabolic function without physical labor. Manual workers require 3,000 to 3,500 calories. Germans clearing rubble, working in factories, walking miles daily to search for food, needed 3,000 calories minimum. They received 1,000 to 1,500. The mathematics of starvation were precise and unavoidable. The Allied occupation forces understood these numbers. They had calculated them deliberately, balancing German survival against limited resources and political priorities. Keep Germans alive. Don't let them thrive. The rations achieved this goal perfectly, creating a population too weak to rebel but not quite weak enough to die in numbers that would create international scandal. The starvation had roots deeper than occupation policy. German agricultural production collapsed between 1938 and 1946. The 1946 harvest yielded 2.8 million tons of grain. In 1938, German farms produced 6.9 million tons, a 59% reduction. The missing 4.1 million tons represented the difference between adequacy and famine. Multiple factors created this collapse. The Nazi war machine had drafted farmers. Chemical fertilizer production, diverted to explosives manufacturing, ceased. Tractors and horses disappeared to military service. Allied bombing destroyed agricultural machinery. Occupation authorities dismantled remaining factories for reparations. The land remained. The means to cultivate it did not. Germans grew thinner with mathematical precision. Medical records documented weight loss throughout the occupation. The average adult German lost 15 to 25 pounds between May 1945 and winter 1947. In Hamburg, by January 1947, 30% of the population showed clinical signs of malnutrition, hollow cheeks, protruding bones, lethargy, and the psychological flatness that accompanies sustained hunger. Children suffered more visibly. Growth requires calories beyond survival needs. German children received survival calories only. Studies conducted by British medical teams found that German 10-year-olds in 1947 measured 4.8 centimeters shorter on average than the 1938 cohort. Rickets, a disease of vitamin deficiency, appeared in 42% of children under 10 in the British zone. These were not war injuries. These were starvation injuries, inflicted after peace arrived. The black market prices measured the desperation. Berlin, December 1946. 1 kilogram of potatoes cost 25 Reichsmarks on the black market, or 3 cigarettes. Potatoes, the cheapest, most basic food, the sustenance that kept peasants alive for centuries, required either currency nobody trusted or tobacco everybody wanted. 1 kilogram of butter, essential fat that prevented wasting disease, cost 250 Reichsmarks or 25 to 30 cigarettes. That single kilogram represented 2 weeks' wages for a factory worker at official rates, or 1.5 cartons of American cigarettes. A live chicken, perhaps 2 kilograms of meat and fat, cost 800 Reichsmarks or 80 to 100 cigarettes. A week's protein for a family required either an impossible sum of worthless paper or 5 cartons of tobacco. Germans who possessed cigarettes ate. Germans who possessed only Reichsmarks starved. The correlation was absolute and documented in medical records, weight measurements, and mortality statistics. The mortality revealed what ration numbers disguised. Hamburg, Germany's second-largest city, major port, center of commerce. The city tracked deaths meticulously, German efficiency persisting through catastrophe. Deaths from malnutrition and related diseases, tuberculosis, pneumonia, infection diseases that healthy bodies resist, increased 340% between 1945 and 1947 compared to 1938 baseline figures. 340%. Not 3%. Not 34%. More than triple the pre-war death rate, in peacetime, under Allied occupation that promised civilization and democracy. Women and elderly died first. Their bodies, smaller, with fewer reserves, succumbed faster. The young and strong lasted longer, but they too grew weak. By winter 1946, called the Hunger Winter in German memory, the cold combined with starvation to create conditions approaching those in concentration camps that Allied forces had liberated 18 months earlier. The grotesque irony wasn't lost on Germans. They had been freed from Nazi tyranny into Allied supervised starvation. This was the economy that cigarettes served. Not an economy of consumer preferences or market efficiency, but an economy of survival where tobacco functioned as the only reliable bridge between those with food and those dying without it. Americans and other occupiers had food. They had cigarettes. Germans had heirlooms, gold, possessions, accumulated over generations. The exchange rate was simple: family treasures for family survival. The woman trading her Meissen figurine for cigarettes wasn't preserving wealth. She was converting frozen capital, beautiful porcelain that couldn't be eaten, into liquid currency that could be traded for potatoes. The cigarettes themselves weren't the goal. The calories were. Every cigarette represented approximately 80 grams of potatoes, or 20 grams of butter, or 1/100th of a chicken. The mathematics of survival, calculated in tobacco. Germans learned to think in these terms. Not, how much does this cost? But, how many meals does this represent? A gold wedding band, melted down, was worth perhaps 150 cigarettes at peak prices. 150 cigarettes could purchase 15 kilograms of potatoes. 15 kilograms of potatoes, at roughly 700 calories per kilogram, represented 10,500 calories. 3 days of adequate nutrition for a family of 4, or 10 days of survival rations. The wedding band, symbol of eternal love, reduced to 3 days of not starving. This was the economy cigarettes ruled. This was why heirlooms migrated from German hands to American rucksacks. Not greed, though greed played its part. Hunger. The oldest and most powerful economic force. The one that makes all other considerations, sentiment, pride, heritage, disappear like smoke. 69,000 Germans per month, on average, chose cigarettes over starvation between 1945 and 1948. That's not a documented figure. That's the mathematical result of subtracting death rates from projected death rates, calculating how many people survived who shouldn't have based on official rations alone. They survived because the black market, the cigarette economy, the trading of heirlooms for tobacco for food, filled the calorie gap that Allied policy created. A cigarette possessed qualities the Reichsmark could never reclaim. It was portable, divisible, universally desired, impossible to counterfeit, and unlike gold or silver, it could be consumed, making it simultaneously a store of value and a comfort in a world offering neither. The American cigarette achieved what economists call monetary perfection through accident, not design. No government decreed that tobacco would become currency. No treaty established exchange rates. The cigarette standard emerged organically from the wreckage of German monetary collapse because it satisfied every requirement of functional money better than any alternative available. The supply reached Germany in staggering volume. Between 1946 and 1948, approximately 63 billion cigarettes arrived in occupied Germany annually through official military channels. This figure comes from U.S. Army Quartermaster records, tracking supplies delivered to post exchanges, military canteens, and official distribution points. 63 billion cigarettes for roughly 500,000 American, British, and French occupation personnel. That's 126,000 cigarettes per soldier per year, or 345 cigarettes daily. No soldier smoked 345 cigarettes daily. The surplus was intentional. Military planners understood that cigarettes served morale functions beyond smoking. They were gifts, bribes, entertainment, and increasingly, currency. The official channels represented only part of the supply. Another estimated 20 to 30 billion cigarettes reached Germany through black market channels, smuggled in military shipments, purchased in neighboring countries, diverted from legitimate distribution. The total approached 90 billion cigarettes annually, flooding a defeated nation of 65 million people. The price stability proved remarkable. From late 1945 through mid-1948, 1 carton of American cigarettes, 200 cigarettes in 10 packs of 20, maintained a value between 1,200 and 2,000 Reichsmarks on the black market. This range held steady across 30 months while the Reichsmark's official purchasing power declined 89%. The cigarette held value absolutely. The Reichsmark evaporated. Gold couldn't match this stability. Gold prices fluctuated based on supply, demand, and military restrictions on precious metal trading. Silver tarnished, required verification, could be debased. Dollars and British pounds were illegal for German civilians to possess and dangerous for soldiers to trade openly. The cigarette alone maintained consistent value, accepted anywhere, questioned by no one. The denominations created a perfect decimal system. A single cigarette became the smallest unit of currency, worth 6 to 12 Reichsmarks depending on location and time. This single cigarette could purchase items of minimal value, a box of matches, a postage stamp, passage through a checkpoint. Small transactions required small denominations. The cigarette provided them. A pack containing 20 cigarettes was worth 120 to 200 Reichsmarks. Medium value transactions, a kilogram of potatoes, a bar of soap, a used tool, traded at pack level. The pack became the equivalent of a $10 or $20 bill, large enough to matter, small enough for daily commerce. A carton containing 200 cigarettes in 10 packs became the high-value unit, worth 1,200 to 2,000 Reichsmarks. Major transactions, monthly rent, a bicycle, a wedding ring, a Meissen figurine, required cartons. Multiple cartons purchased furniture, livestock, or musical instruments. The carton functioned as a $100 bill, concentration of value in portable form. This three-tier system, single cigarette, pack, carton, created mathematical simplicity. 10 singles in a pack. 10 packs in a carton. 200 cigarettes total. The system required no complex conversion calculations, no exchange rate tables, no specialized knowledge. A German who had never smoked could count cigarettes and understand their wealth instantly. The non-smoker economy revealed cigarettes' pure monetary function. Estimates from occupation authorities and post-war economic studies suggest 70 to 80% of cigarettes circulating in the black market were never smoked. They passed from hand to hand as currency, accumulating ash and wear but never lit. Some cigarettes changed hands dozens of times, growing dog-eared and bent, before finally being consumed or discarded as too damaged for further trading. Germans who despised smoking hoarded cartons like savings accounts. Women who had never touched tobacco became expert in evaluating cigarette quality. Lucky Strike commanded premium prices, Chesterfield and Camel slightly less, British cigarettes even less, and German cigarettes, when available, were nearly worthless. Brand recognition mattered. American tobacco represented trusted value. Everything else was suspect. Allied soldiers discovered they commanded purchasing power beyond imagination. A junior enlisted American soldier earned $50 monthly in 1946. His weekly cigarette ration included 1 carton, costing him nothing, allocated free as standard supply. He could purchase additional cartons at the post exchange for $1 each. That single carton, whether received free or purchased for $1, could be traded on the black market for goods worth $80 to $150 at official exchange rates. The mathematics created temptation few could resist. A private with $100 in savings could purchase 100 cartons. Those cartons, traded carefully over several months, could generate $8,000 to $15,000 in value through the German black market. His annual salary, transformed through tobacco arbitrage into a fortune exceeding what his father might earn in 10 years. Some soldiers accumulated enough wealth to purchase houses outright upon returning home. Financing. The American dream with profits extracted from German desperation. Not all soldiers participated. Many found the practice morally repugnant, trading cigarettes for family heirlooms and desperate favors while Germans starved. But enough participated to make the cigarette economy function smoothly, creating liquid markets where cigarettes converted to goods and goods converted back to cigarettes with efficiency that would have impressed any stock exchange. The occupation authorities attempted to stop it, and failed absolutely. Court-martial proceedings between 1946 and 1948 prosecuted 1,247 American soldiers for black market activities. This number represents a fraction of actual participation. Most soldiers were never caught, and many officers deliberately looked away from activities they privately considered victimless, or even beneficial. The prosecuted cases served as examples, meant to deter others. They deterred no one. The profit margins were too high, the enforcement too weak, the temptation too overwhelming. British and French soldiers faced similar situations with slightly less access to American cigarettes, which commanded the highest prices. British soldiers received British cigarettes, less desirable but still valuable. French occupation forces, many composed of colonial troops from North Africa and Indochina, became particularly active traders, their outsider status making them less concerned with fraternization rules or occupation policy. Regional price variations created arbitrage opportunities. Cigarettes commanded higher prices in Soviet-occupied Berlin than in American-occupied Munich. Traders bought cheap in one zone and sold dear in another, the same fundamental trading that has driven commerce since humans first exchanged goods. The commodity happened to be tobacco. The profits happened to come from human suffering. The trade continued regardless. By 1947, the cigarette had achieved complete monetary dominance across occupied Germany. Price lists in markets, whether legal or black, listed values in cigarettes alongside or instead of Reichsmarks. 3 cigarettes communicated value more clearly than 25 Reichsmarks, because everyone knew the cigarette held real purchasing power while the Reichsmark represented fiction. The cigarette standard functioned better than gold, better than dollars, better than any formal currency system the occupation authorities attempted to impose. It required no government backing, no legal tender laws, no enforcement mechanism. It functioned through consensus, through universal recognition that tobacco had value and paper did not. The woman at Potsdamer Platz accepted cigarettes for her Meissen figurine because she knew those cigarettes would buy food tomorrow. The soldier who gave her cigarettes knew he could acquire 10 more cartons at the PX for $10 and repeat the transaction. The farmer who eventually received those cigarettes knew he could trade them for tools, for clothing, for anything he needed. The cigarette circulated, trusted by all, backed by nothing except shared belief in its value. The objects appearing in black markets across occupied Germany represented not just personal possessions but the accumulated capital of German prosperity. Biedermeier furniture, Leica cameras, Steve teddy bears, and yes, Meissen porcelain, all migrating from German families to Allied soldiers at exchange rates that would have been criminal in peacetime. 300 years of German wealth changed hands between 1945 and 1948. Objects that families had preserved through the Napoleonic Wars, through German unification, through the First World War, through inflation and depression, these heirlooms survived history only to be traded for cigarettes to survive hunger. The transfer wasn't theft, though later generations would feel it as such. It was commerce, conducted under conditions that made fair value impossible and desperation inevitable. The categories of traded objects revealed which aspects of civilization Germans sacrificed first. Jewelry and precious metals moved earliest and fastest. Wedding bands averaged 12 to 20 cigarettes depending on weight and purity. A 14-gram gold ring, the standard size for a man's wedding band, brought 15 to 18 cigarettes in late 1945. That's 1.5 to 2 packs. 3 weeks of marriage symbolism converted to 3 days of bread rations. Gold watches commanded 80 to 150 cigarettes, depending on maker and condition. A quality pocket watch from a respected manufacturer, Lang & Son, Glashut, could bring 200 cigarettes, an entire carton, if the soldier purchasing it recognized value. Most didn't. To young Americans from farms in Iowa or factories in Detroit, a German pocket watch was just a watch. They paid generic prices, unaware they were purchasing instruments that would later sell in American antique shops for hundreds of dollars. Household goods followed jewelry into the cigarette economy. Silver candlesticks, tarnished from lack of polish during war years, traded for 100 to 200 cigarettes per pair. Complete silver flatware services, 60 to 80 pieces representing generations of family dinners, brought 300 to 500 cigarettes if the soldier wanted the entire set. Individual pieces brought less. Germans learned quickly that selling complete sets brought better returns, but hunger didn't always permit waiting for buyers who wanted full collections. China and porcelain prices varied wildly based on recognition. A Meissen figurine could bring 20 cigarettes from a soldier who saw only a ceramic statue, or 300 cigarettes from an officer who understood European porcelain. The shepherdess with lamb, the piece traded at Potsdamer Platz, likely brought 50 to 70 cigarettes, mid-range pricing reflecting that it was quality work but not exceptional. recognized as valuable but not extraordinary. Pre-war auction prices for comparable Meissen pieces ranged from 400 to 2,000 Reichsmarks when the Reichsmark meant something. The cigarette prices, converted at black market rates, represented 40 to 80% depreciation in real terms. Families lost half or more of their heirlooms' value in transactions conducted from desperation, not choice. Musical instruments created particular tragedy. A violin could bring 200 to 800 cigarettes depending on maker, condition, and the soldier's ability to recognize quality. Cheap student instruments brought the same price as valuable ones if the purchaser couldn't distinguish German workshop violins from Czech factory production. Stradivarius copies, some made by genuine craftsmen, traded for prices that would have offended their makers' ghosts. Pianos represented the largest single household items traded. Moving a piano required coordination, transportation, and strength, resources scarce in post-war Germany. Families traded pianos for 2,000 to 5,000 cigarettes, 10 to 25 cartons, because moving them would cost more than they'd bring. American officers furnished their temporary quarters with Bechstein and Bluthner pianos purchased for $50 in cigarettes, instruments worth thousands in pre-war currency. When occupation duty ended, most pianos stayed behind, too expensive to ship home, abandoned in German houses or warehoused by the military. The geographic concentration of this trade created permanent markets. Berlin's Tiergarten became the largest black market in occupied Europe. 50,000 traders appeared daily at peak periods in 1946, conducting business in open violation of occupation law. The authorities eventually gave up suppressing it. They couldn't arrest 50,000 people daily, and every arrested trader was replaced by 2 more the next morning. Hamburg's Hansaplatz, Munich's Mollstrasse, Frankfurt's Kaiserstrasse. Every major German city developed designated black market zones where the heirloom economy functioned openly. Soldiers knew where to go. Germans knew where to sell. The markets operated with hours, with regular traders who specialized in particular goods, with reputation systems that mattered because repeat business required trust even in illegal commerce. Allied acquisition rates revealed the scale. U.S. Army Provost Marshal estimates suggested 60% of enlisted personnel in occupied Germany engaged in black market trading at some level. That's roughly 300,000 American soldiers, plus tens of thousands of British and French troops, all purchasing German goods with cigarettes and shipping them home as war souvenirs. Official investigations prosecuted fewer than 2% of participants. The rest mailed packages home, filled with porcelain, jewelry, cameras, watches, and smaller antiques. Post office records from 1946 to 1948 showed a surge in packages mailed from Germany to the United States, contents declared as war souvenirs but actual value estimates ranging into millions of dollars in displaced German wealth. The American soldiers weren't looters in the traditional sense. They paid for everything, in cigarettes. The transactions were voluntary. Germans chose to sell. But choice made under starvation isn't free choice. It's survival mathematics dressed in commercial language. The soldier offering 100 cigarettes for a gold watch was offering survival. The German accepting was choosing to eat rather than tell time. Some goods carried additional weight beyond monetary value. Jewish property, seized during the Nazi years, now circulated again through black markets. Silver candlesticks that had graced Shabbat tables, Torah pointers, mezuzahs, prayer books, these items, stolen once by Nazis, were now being sold again by Germans who had purchased them during Aryanization or found them in abandoned Jewish homes. Allied soldiers bought them without knowing their history, adding layers of tragedy to objects that had survived persecution only to become cigarette currency. The Red Cross packages distributed monthly to German civilians included chocolate, candied bars, instant coffee, processed cheese, crackers, canned meat, cigarettes, and soap. These packages supplemented official rations with luxury items that exceeded what German civilians could obtain legally. The American Red Cross records show standard parcels typically contained 2 to 4 chocolate bars among other goods. Germans receiving these packages often sold the contents immediately. The chocolate bars alone brought 10 to 15 cigarettes each on the black market. The full package contents, if sold rather than consumed, could generate 40 to 60 cigarettes, enough to purchase 5 to 6 kilograms of potatoes or half a kilogram of butter. For families deciding between consuming American candy or trading it for staples, the choice was obvious. Chocolate was luxury. Potatoes were survival. By late 1946, the heirloom migration had become systematic enough that American antique dealers sent representatives to occupy Germany. These buyers, some of them German Jewish refugees who had escaped before the war, returned to purchase at cigarette prices the same categories of goods their families once owned. The moral complexity was infinite, victims profiting from perpetrators' distress, capitalism functioning without conscience, survival requiring everyone to participate in an economy nobody would defend. The mathematics revealed the transfer scale. If 60% of 300,000 American soldiers acquired even modest amounts of German goods, say, $500 worth at pre-war values per soldier, the total transfer exceeded $75 million in 1946 values, equivalent to roughly $1 billion today. This figure excludes British and French acquisition, civilian trading, and goods that changed hands multiple times before leaving Germany. Generations of accumulated wealth, converted to tobacco, converted to survival, converted to American property. The Meissen shepherdess wasn't unique. She had millions of companions, figurines and watches and candlesticks and violins, all making the same journey from German heritage to American mantelpieces, purchased not with currency but with cigarettes that Germans needed more than memory. The heirloom economy functioned because both sides understood the transaction's necessity. Soldiers wanted souvenirs, investments, or simply bargains too good to refuse. Germans wanted survival. The cigarette bridged these desires, transforming family history into calories, converting porcelain into bread, making the past into fuel for the present. When the Deutsche Mark arrived in 1948 and the cigarette economy collapsed, the heirlooms were already gone. Currency reform restored financial stability but couldn't restore the objects German families had traded away. Those losses became permanent. The price paid for surviving the cigarette years, calculated in wedding bands and porcelain shepherdesses, in silver candlesticks and violins, in 3 centuries of prosperity converted to 3 years of tobacco. While photographs immortalized the Trümmerfrauen, rubble women, clearing Berlin's debris brick by brick, fewer cameras documented their evening migrations to black markets, where the same hands that cleared rubble traded family treasures for the cigarettes that kept their families alive. The women who rebuilt Germany did so twice. Once with their backs, clearing 400 million cubic meters of rubble from Berlin alone between 1945 and 1948. Once with their dignity, trading everything families had accumulated to survive an economy that paid starvation wages for backbreaking labor. The iconic images of women passing bricks hand to hand, forming human chains through destroyed cities, captured only half the story. The other half occurred after dark, in marketplaces where survival required different transactions entirely. The demographics created this necessity. In Berlin, 1945, women outnumbered men by a ratio of 3 to 2. Among those aged 18 to 45, the ratio reached 5 to 2. The Wehrmacht had consumed Germany's young men, killed, captured, or crippled. What remained was a female population responsible for children, elderly parents, and their own survival in an economy offering no employment suitable for women under traditional German social structures. The rubble work paid 60 pfennigs daily plus a meager food ration. 60 pfennigs. At 1,946 black market rates, this purchased 1/10 of a kilogram of potatoes. 1 day's labor, 8 hours breaking concrete and hauling bricks, earned enough to purchase 100 grams of potatoes. 500 calories if eaten as the sole food source. A woman needed 1,200 calories minimum to sustain the labor. The mathematics made continued work impossible without supplemental income. The Trümmerfrauen worked because they had no choice, and they survived because they found income sources the occupation authorities didn't photograph. Approximately 400,000 women in Berlin alone cleared rubble during the occupation years. They worked in organized teams, supervised by Allied military authorities who mandated rubble clearing as civic duty. The work destroyed hands, backs, and spirits. Bricks had to be cleaned individually, mortar chipped away, because Germany lacked resources to manufacture new building materials. Every salvaged brick was numbered, sorted, stacked for future reconstruction. The women received tools inadequate for the task: hammers, chisels, buckets. No machinery. No trucks in the early months. Human strength moved mountains of debris, one brick at a time, earning wages that couldn't sustain life. They found other ways. Women comprised 60 to 70% of black market traders. According to occupation authority estimates, they appeared in markets with items small enough to transport, valuable enough to matter. A silver spoon. A piece of jewelry. A child's toy in good condition. The larger items, furniture, pianos, major heirlooms, required male intermediaries or prearranged sales. But the daily trade, the constant flow of smaller objects converting to cigarettes, converting to food, was female commerce conducted by necessity. The hamster trips became institution and ordeal. Women traveled to rural areas to trade possessions for food directly from farmers, bypassing black market middlemen. A typical trip covered 20 to 40 kilometers each way, on foot or by damaged rail lines, carrying 20 to 30 kilograms of tradable goods in rucksacks and bags. Official records counted 32 million such trips between 1945 and 1947. 32 million journeys. Women leaving cities at dawn, traveling to farms, trading grandmother's candlesticks for potatoes and lard, returning by evening if fortunate, sleeping in barns or fields if not. Some women made these trips weekly. Some died trying, killed by exposure, by exhaustion, by the violence that lawless areas permitted. Farmers demanded high prices. They had food. Cities had none. A silver fork might purchase 5 kilograms of potatoes in Berlin's black market, but only 3 kilograms direct from a farmer who knew his leverage. Women paid the premium because direct trading eliminated cigarette middlemen. They couldn't afford cigarettes to begin with. The prostitution economy operated parallel to and intertwined with the cigarette economy. By late 1946, occupation medical authorities estimated 30,000 to 50,000 women in Berlin engaged in prostitution for Allied forces. Some were professionals who had practiced the trade before the war. Most were amateurs, office workers, teachers, housewives, driven by starvation to commerce their bodies couldn't refuse. The typical payment was 1 to 5 cigarettes per encounter, or a chocolate bar of equivalent value. Medical reports from British and American occupation forces documented pregnancy rates of 30 to 40% among women under 25 engaged in prostitution. These weren't casual statistics. They represented tens of thousands of pregnancies, many unwanted, resulting from transactions conducted for cigarettes that purchased bread. The occupation authorities knew and mostly ignored it. Some commanders attempted crackdowns, arresting women and confining them. The arrests changed nothing. Released women returned to the same commerce because the same hunger remained. Eventually, most occupation zones established medical inspection regimes, checking prostitutes for disease weekly, providing some minimal health care, tacitly accepting that the trade would continue regardless of military law. The children became traders too. Boys and girls as young as 8 to 12 served as cigarette economy intermediaries. They faced fewer legal consequences than adults. Occupation courts rarely prosecuted children. They navigated checkpoints more easily, looking innocent while carrying contraband. They begged cigarettes from soldiers, then traded them for food or sold them to adults. Estimates suggest 15,000 children in Berlin earned family income through black market activity. They weren't criminals by nature. They were children adapting to an economy that required everyone to participate or starve. Some specialized in particular trades, retrieving cigarette butts that soldiers discarded, collecting them, drying them, selling the remaining tobacco. Others operated as runners, carrying messages between traders, coordinating deals for percentage fees paid in cigarettes or food. The most heartbreaking accounts come from mothers who sent daughters to occupation forces. Not prostitution exactly, though it amounted to the same thing. Friendship, with soldiers who provided cigarettes, chocolate, and canned goods in exchange for company. Teenage girls entertaining men twice their age because their families needed the American PX supplies those men could provide. The girls rarely spoke English. The soldiers rarely spoke German. The cigarettes communicated everything necessary. These transactions left no paper trail. They appear in memoirs, in oral histories, in medical records documenting pregnancy and disease. Official histories ignored them. The photographs showed only brave women clearing rubble, rebuilding Germany with determination and strength. The cameras never captured the evening hours, the transactions in dark corners, the dignity sacrificed so children could eat. The cigarette cartons the Trümmerfrauen earned through day labor, black market trading, hamster trips, and methods no mother wanted to discuss. Those cartons purchased survival. A single carton, 200 cigarettes, could feed a family for a week if traded carefully. The woman who cleared rubble for 60 pfennigs daily needed additional income sources, and German society in 1946 offered exactly two: selling possessions or selling self. Most did both. The rubble women's burden exceeded clearing debris. They cleared their families' accumulated wealth, trading it brick by brick into the cigarette economy. They cleared their own dignity when necessary, though this clearing left scars no reconstruction could repair. They rebuilt German cities while dismantling German pride, working harder than men had ever worked, earning less than survival required, and filling the gap through commerce that society would later pretend never occurred. By 1948, when currency reform arrived and cigarettes returned to being merely tobacco, the rubble women had cleared most of Berlin's debris. 400 million cubic meters moved by hand. They had also cleared their families' heirlooms, their savings, and whatever innocence remained after war and occupation. The rebuilding succeeded. The cost was calculated in cigarettes and in things currency couldn't measure, the price paid by women who had no choice except to pay it, recorded not in official histories but in silence and shame that persisted for generations. The photographs of women passing bricks hand to hand became symbols of German resilience. The photographs were real, but incomplete. The complete story required acknowledging that the same women passing bricks by day passed other things by night, in markets and alleys, trading what remained of the old Germany for the cigarettes that made the new Germany possible. In the Soviet zone, cigarette currency purchased not just bread but something far more valuable and infinitely more tragic: silence from the Red Army soldiers who treated German women as spoils of war, making tobacco the price of safety itself. While the Western zone struggled with chaotic black markets fueled by American abundance, the Soviet zone in the East faced a calculated, state-sponsored dismantling. Moscow, viewing Germany not as a potential partner but as a reservoir of reparations, initiated an industrial extraction of biblical proportions. Between May 1945 and 1948, Soviet authorities completely dismantled 3,200 factories. They stripped the foundations, packed the equipment, and shipped 1.3 million tons of machinery east to the USSR. This was not merely the seizure of assets, it was the surgical removal of an economy's heart. By 1948, the Soviet zone had lost 45% of its industrial capacity. The very tools required to rebuild, lathes, presses, turbines, were loaded onto flatbed railcars, leaving behind hollowed-out brick shells and a workforce with nothing to work on. The extraction extended to the soil itself. Even as the German population teetered on the edge of starvation, Soviet requisitions claimed between 25% and 35% of all food production in the zone from 1945 to 1948. The caloric mathematics were brutal. While West Germans in the American and British zones survived on a meager average of 1,330 to 1,550 calories daily, East Germans were forced to subsist on just 1,090. This 400-calorie deficit was the difference between chronic hunger and slow death. In this environment of absolute scarcity, the cigarette ceased to be a luxury good and became a tool of physical negotiation. The initial occupation of Berlin in April and May 1945 had established a terrifying precedent. Historical estimates document between 100,000 and 200,000 rapes in Berlin alone during those first 8 weeks. As the occupation settled into a permanent administration, the chaotic violence evolved into a transactional menace. Soviet soldiers, often unpaid and disciplined only sporadically, held absolute power over the civilian population. In this vacuum of law, cigarettes and alcohol became the only recognized currency of protection. German families quickly learned that a carton of American cigarettes, often obtained through dangerous trades with contacts in the western sectors, could be used to bribe a local commander or placate a patrol. Diaries from the period document the rise of protection relationships, a euphemism for a desperate arrangement where German women or families provided specific soldiers with alcohol and tobacco in exchange for a guarantee of safety from other troops. Safety was no longer a right. It was a commodity, priced in nicotine. The physical toll of this economy manifested in the bodies of the population. The winter of 1946-47, known across Germany as the Hunger Winter, hit the Soviet zone with particular savagery. Without the coal from the Ruhr or the food imports beginning to flow into the West, the East froze and starved. Comparative mortality statistics revealed the disparity. Mortality rates in the Soviet zone exceeded those in the Western zones by 34%. Disease followed the malnutrition. Tuberculosis rates in the East soared to 210% higher than in the West. But the most damning evidence appeared in the children. Medical examinations conducted in 1947 found that among children under 10 years old in the Soviet zone, stunting rates reached 47%, compared to 28% in the West. Nearly half a generation was physically permanently marked by the politics of extraction. Faced with an economy of dismantling and a currency of survival, the population voted with their feet. Despite strict occupation laws prohibiting movement, and a border that would eventually become a death strip, the exodus was massive. Between 1945 and 1949, 3.5 million Germans fled the Soviet zone for the West. They left behind homes, land, and history, carrying only what they could wear. To cross the demarcation lines, they often paid exit taxes to border guards, bribes paid not in Reichsmarks, which the guards knew were worthless, but in the universal hard currency of the era, cigarettes, jewelry, or, in the darkest cases, sexual favors. In the West, the cigarette was a symbol of the black market's chaotic vitality, a way to buy coffee or stockings. In the East, it was a darker token. It was the price of a machine that wasn't stolen, a calorie that wasn't requisitioned, and a night where the door remained locked against the occupier. The young American private earning $50 monthly discovered he wielded more economic power in occupied Germany than bank presidents possessed in peacetime, and many couldn't resist the temptation of becoming tobacco millionaires. The economics of the occupation were defined by a distortion so severe it defied conventional accounting. Inside the gates of the Post Exchange, or PX, the American military subsidized the illusion of home. Here, a pack of cigarettes cost exactly 5 cents. A full carton of 10 packs cost $1. But the moment that soldier stepped off the base and into the ruins of Berlin or Frankfurt, the laws of supply and demand violently reasserted themselves. On the street, that same 5-cent pack of cigarettes traded for between $1 and $1.50. This represented an immediate profit margin of 2,000% to 3,000%. For the ambitious, the carton offered even starker mathematics. Purchased for a single dollar note, a carton commanded between $80 and $150 on the black market. In a single transaction, a private could triple his monthly military salary. This was not merely profit. It was wealth creation at a speed that rendered military discipline irrelevant. The barrier to this wealth was ostensibly the non-fraternization policy. From September 1944 to September 1945, Allied commands strictly prohibited social contact with the German population. The penalty for violation was a $65 fine, a substantial sum in pre-war terms, but a laughable operational expense in the cigarette economy. A soldier could pay the fine with the profits from a single carton and still retain $85 in profit. Enforcement collapsed under the weight of simple arithmetic. By late 1945, military surveys indicated that 70% of soldiers admitted to violating the ban. The lure of the market was stronger than the threat of the brig. This economic gravity warped the chain of command. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. Army courts-martial prosecuted 1,247 soldiers specifically for black market activities. Yet these prosecutions revealed a system rotting from the head down. JAG investigations determined that 15% of all officer misconduct cases during this period involved black market trading. The corruption was organized and hierarchical. In Frankfurt, military police uncovered a ring involving 3 majors and 7 lieutenants who had moved beyond casual trading to coordinate the systematic diversion of PX supplies. They treated military logistics as a private import-export business. The highest-profile individual case, redacted in public records as Major John Doe, involved an officer caught with $250,000 in traded goods and currency. In 1948, that sum was sufficient to purchase entire city blocks in the United States. The military justice system struggled to address crimes that technically enriched everyone involved. The average punishment for these offenses ranged from reduction in rank to 30 or 90 days of confinement. For a soldier sitting on a hidden cache of diamonds, Leicas, and Meissen porcelain acquired for tobacco, 3 months in a stockade was a calculated investment risk. The cigarette economy created its own geography. The British and French zones operated under different constraints. British soldiers, paid less and with restricted access to the abundance of the American PX, found themselves the poor relations of the occupation. French colonial troops, many recruited from Africa, were documented by military police as particularly active traders, leveraging their positions to bridge the supply gaps. This disparity birthed a secondary market of cigarette arbitrage. Because supply fluctuated between the zones based on troop movements and PX shipments, a carton of Lucky Strikes might be worth $100 in the American zone, but $130 in the French sector. Soldiers and German intermediaries moved tobacco across internal borders like currency speculators moving gold, chasing the spread. The result was an occupation where the conqueror became the supplier. The American GI was no longer just a soldier. He was the central banker of the German recovery, issuing the only currency the population trusted. He walked through the rubble not just with a rifle, but with pockets full of liquid assets, buying heirlooms, loyalty, and labor with a currency that cost him a nickel. German children born in 1940 remembered no economy except cigarettes, no commerce except barter, no childhood except hunger, and their warped education in survival would shape West German economic behavior for decades. For this generation, the war did not end in May 1945. It simply changed shape. The aerial bombardments ceased, but the quiet violence of malnutrition took their place. In the British zone, medical teams cataloging the population found that rickets, a disease of vitamin D deficiency that softened bones, had been diagnosed in 42% of all children under 10. The physical evidence of the cigarette economy was measured in centimeters. By 1947, the average 10-year-old German boy stood exactly 4.8 centimeters shorter than the 1938 cohort. They were a shrinking generation, physically diminishing as their nation's currency collapsed into smoke. In Hamburg, a city pulverized by Allied firestorms, the statistics of survival turned grim. Child mortality for those under age 5, which had stood at 4.7% in 1938, surged to 11.2% by 1946. 1 in 10 children did not survive the peace. The lucky ones learned to navigate a world where a lucky strike held more value than a Reichsmark. This environment produced a psychological phenomenon that British occupation medical teams termed affect blunting. In a clinical study of the youth population, they documented that 60% of children displayed a profound emotional numbing, a psychological callus developed from chronic trauma and unrelenting hunger. They did not cry because crying burned calories. Another study identified a condition labeled amoral acquisition behavior in 35% of subjects. These children stole food, coal, and tobacco without a flicker of guilt response. They were not criminals in the traditional sense. They were efficient biological engines adapted to an ecosystem where morality was a caloric luxury they could not afford. The streets became their classroom. By 1947, an estimated 500,000 German children were classified as orphaned or permanently separated from their parents. Many lived in the cellars of bombed-out ruins, forming feral economies of their own. Documentation from American military police records accounts of children as young as 8 operating as seasoned currency traders. These cigarette orphans scavenged butts from gutters, stole packs from careless GIs, or received them as charity, only to immediately convert the tobacco into bread or potatoes. They understood the exchange rates of the black market better than they understood the alphabet. Formal education had effectively collapsed. In the major cities, 78% of school buildings had been damaged or destroyed. Average attendance dropped to 60% of pre-war levels, and for those who attended, the school day often consisted of only 2 or 3 hours of instruction in unheated rooms. The curriculum shifted by necessity. Trigonometry and literature were replaced by the practical skills of scavenging. A child who could not conjugate verbs but could spot a discarded cigarette end was more likely to eat dinner. The intervention, when it arrived, was industrial in scale. In June 1946, the United States initiated massive school feeding programs. Initially reaching 850,000 children, the program expanded to cover 3.5 million by 1948. This was the Pulverspeisung, a daily meal providing between 350 and 500 additional calories. It was a calculated injection of energy into a failing biological system. The results were immediate and measurable. Medical records tracked participants gaining an average of 2.3 kilograms over a 6-month period. Yet the psychological imprint remained. This generation, the children of Ash, grew up with the foundational belief that money was a fiction and that stability was a fragile veneer over chaos. Their adulthood would be defined by an aggressive pursuit of hard assets and economic security, a direct response to a childhood where a pack of cigarettes was the only thing that stood between a family and starvation. They learned that in the end, you could not eat a banknote, but you could always trade a smoke. On Friday, June 18, 1948, a cigarette carton could purchase a month's food. By Monday, June 21, shop windows across West Germany filled with goods that hadn't been seen in years, and cigarettes returned to being something you merely smoked. The death of the cigarette economy did not happen gradually. It was an execution, planned in secret and carried out over a single weekend. For 3 years, the American Lucky Strike and the British Players' Navy Cut had served as the de facto central bankers of Europe, holding value while the Reichsmark rotted. But at 8 p.m. on Friday, June 18, the Allied Military Command interrupted radio broadcasts to announce that the game was over. The mechanism of the change was brutal in its simplicity. Beginning Sunday, June 20th, the Reichsmark would be invalid. Every German citizen was ordered to report to local food rationing offices to receive the new currency, the Deutsche Mark. The initial allocation was strict, 40 Deutsche Marks per person immediately, followed by another 20 Deutsche Marks 1 month later. This was not a currency exchange, it was a wealth demolition. The conversion rate for savings accounts, bonds, and insurance policies was set at 100 to 6.5. A family that had dutifully saved 10,000 Reichsmarks found themselves holding just 650 Deutsche Marks. In a single administrative stroke, 93.5% of the paper wealth in Western Germany was vaporized. The only exceptions to this financial violence were wages, rents, and pensions, which converted at a 1-to-1 ratio, a deliberate policy decision to wipe out the black market war profiteers while protecting the working class. The immediate reaction was the cigar crisis. Economist Ludwig Erhard, the architect of this reform, estimated that on the morning of June 20th, Germans held approximately 10 billion cigarettes in private hoards, treating them as high-yield savings bonds. By the evening of June 20th, those cigarettes were just drying tobacco leaves. Panic selling erupted instantly. Traders who had demanded hundreds of Reichsmarks for a single pack on Friday were begging for pennies on Sunday. The black market price collapsed. A single cigarette, which had commanded a value equivalent to 1,800 Reichsmarks on the old scale, dropped to a real value of 2 or 3 Deutsche Marks within days. By June 27, the price had crashed 85%. The cigarette millionaires, the GIs and the German black marketeers who had amassed fortunes in tobacco, saw their net worth dissolve. But if the weekend brought financial ruin to the hoarders, Monday, June 21st, brought a visual miracle to the streets. The transformation was instantaneous. For years, shopkeepers had hoarded physical goods, refusing to sell them for worthless paper money. They sat on inventory, waiting for a currency they could trust. The moment the Deutsche Mark became legal tender, the dams burst. On Monday morning, citizens walked past storefronts that had been empty since 1945, only to find them suddenly stocked with vegetables, textiles, tools, and household goods. The black market, which had facilitated nearly all commerce for 3 years, declined by 90% within a single week. It didn't disappear because of police enforcement. It disappeared because money finally worked. The production statistics validate the visual anecdotes. In the third quarter of 1948, industrial production in the western zones surged 35% compared to the second quarter. The factories had been there, and the workers had been there, but the connective tissue of reliable money had been missing. Within 6 months, the availability of consumer goods in stores rose from an estimated 15% of pre-war levels to 70%. The paralysis was broken. However, this economic surgery severed Germany in half. The currency reform was implemented strictly in the American, British, and French zones. It deliberately excluded the Soviet zone, effectively creating 2 separate economic nations overnight. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin interpreted the introduction of the Deutsche Mark not as an economic stabilization measure, but as an act of aggressive state building. His response was military. On June 24, 1948, just 4 days after the new currency entered circulation, Soviet troops halted all rail, road, and water traffic into West Berlin. The Berlin blockade had begun. Stalin explicitly cited the currency reform as the provocation. The cigarette economy had ended, but the Cold War had officially started, triggered by the introduction of a printed piece of paper that finally had more value than a pack of Lucky Strikes. The Deutsche Mark restored stores and production, but it could not restore the Meissen figurines already shipping to America, the dignity traded for potatoes, or the moral framework destroyed when survival required becoming a black marketeer or worse. While the currency reform of June 1948 is celebrated as the spark of the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, the ledger of what was lost before that date remains a study in catastrophic wealth transfer. Economists analyzing the period from 1945 to 1948 estimate that German families liquidated tangible assets worth between 15 and 25 billion Deutsche Marks, measured in pre-war purchasing power, simply to secure basic necessities. This was not normal commerce. It was a distressed liquidation of a middle class. Less than 10% of this transferred wealth was ever recovered or compensated. The grandmother who traded her silver wedding service for 3 sacks of coal and a carton of Lucky Strikes in the winter of 1947 engaged in a transaction that saved her life but permanently erased her family's accumulated capital. The currency reform halted the black market, but it provided no mechanism to buy back the heirlooms that were now sitting in footlockers aboard transport ships headed for Ohio and New York. The scale of this cultural hemorrhage is recorded in the quiet archives of international law enforcement. The post-war section of Interpol's art theft database lists over 40,000 items of German origin that vanished during this specific 3-year window. Museum curators in the United States have documented a distinct pattern of acquisitions from the late 1940s, porcelain, sketches, and jewelry, that matched the descriptions of items known to have been in private German collections before the surrender. These objects were rarely stolen at gunpoint. They were purchased, legally, in the context of the time, where a Renaissance etching worth a university education traded for the caloric equivalent of a week's rations. The social cost of the cigarette economy proved even more corrosive than the financial loss. The survival mechanisms required to navigate the occupation dismantled the traditional German family structure. In the Western zones between 1945 and 1950, divorce rates spiked to 3.2 times the pre-war average. The desperate alliances formed to secure food often could not survive the return of stability. More telling are the statistics regarding illegitimate births. The rate climbed to 4.1 times the pre-war baseline. Many of these children were fathered by occupation soldiers, the living byproducts of relationships that existed in the gray zone between romance and transactional survival. For the women who held these families together, the psychological pressure was often lethal. Suicide rates among women aged 25 to 45, the precise demographic responsible for navigating the black market to feed children and elderly parents, rose to 2.7 times the pre-war baseline. For approximately 20,000 German women between 1945 and 1949, the solution was emigration through marriage. The War Brides Act of 1946 facilitated these unions, allowing German women to marry American soldiers and enter the United States. While many of these marriages were genuine love matches, historical sociologists note the prevalence of survival relationships that began as pragmatic exchanges of protection and food for companionship. The marriage license became the ultimate exit visa from the ruins, but it often required leaving behind families who had not found an American sponsor. The psychological scars of this period lingered long after the rubble was cleared. The economic miracle rebuilt the factories, but it could not repair the minds of those who had survived the years of ash. German psychological studies conducted in the 1960s focused on the occupation generation, those who had been between the ages of 10 and 30 during the height of the cigarette economy. The clinical findings were damning. This demographic exhibited rates of anxiety disorders 42% higher than the generational baseline, and depression rates 38% higher. Clinicians later identified a widespread phenomenon of affect blunting and symptoms consistent with what is now termed post-traumatic stress disorder. These conditions were born not from the battlefield, but from the relentless, degrading adrenaline of daily survival, the trauma of a society where the rule of law had been replaced by the rule of the carton, and where the difference between eating and starving was a pack of cigarettes. The Germany that emerged from cigarette currency became the most stable, prosperous democracy in European history, perhaps because its citizens learned in the most visceral way possible what happens when money, law, and civilization simultaneously fail. The statistical trajectory of the German recovery defies standard economic modeling. In 1948, the gross domestic product of the Western zones languished at approximately 58% of its 1938 level. The nation was a smoking ruin, physically and financially. Yet, once the cigarette was replaced by the Deutsche Mark, the recovery speed was violent in its upward velocity. By 1950, production had recovered to 99% of pre-war levels. By 1955, it hit 172%. By 1960, West Germany's economy stood at 265% of its 1938 output. Historians call this the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. But to the generation that lived it, this was not a miracle, it was a trauma response. The foundational institutions of modern Germany were built by men and women who had seen the abyss. When West Germany established its central bank, the Bundesbank, in 1957, it was granted constitutional independence and anti-inflationary powers stronger than any other central bank on earth. This rigidity was not theoretical. It was designed by a generation that had lived through two complete currency collapses in 25 years, the hyperinflation of 1923 and the cigarette economy of 1945 to 1948. They encoded their fear of worthless money into the DNA of the state. Yet, this stability was purchased with a collective amnesia regarding the criminal origins of their survival. The West German government made a pragmatic, silent decision. There would be no reckoning for the black market. Although existing laws made the trading of rationed goods illegal, the state never prosecuted German citizens for their wartime or post-war black market activities. The mathematics of justice made it impossible. with estimates suggesting that 70% to 80% of the entire population had participated in illegal trading to survive. Prosecuting the black market would have meant arresting the entire nation. Instead, a blanket of silence descended. A tacit social contract emerged where neighbors agreed not to ask how the butcher acquired his new delivery truck, or how the widow suddenly afforded a new roof. This silence, however, covered a deep, unaddressed class wound. While the 1950s and 1960s saw extensive and necessary legal frameworks established to provide restitution to victims of Nazi persecution, almost no mechanism existed to compensate the millions of Germans who had liquidated their family wealth in the cigarette economy. The working-class family that traded a grand piano for a sack of potatoes in 1947 remained poor. The opportunist who bought that piano for the price of a carton of Lucky Strikes remained rich. This illegitimate transfer of wealth, the heirloom drain, calcified into a permanent class resentment that rippled beneath the surface of the new prosperity. This discomfort with the past is reflected in modern memory. Today, German school curricula dedicate extensive, mandatory hours to the Holocaust and the military history of World War II. In contrast, the period of the cigarette economy receives an average of just 2 to 3 hours of instruction. Surveys indicate that 60% of Germans under the age of 40 are unaware that American cigarettes once functioned as their nation's sole hard currency. The era remains psychologically uncomfortable. It fits neither the narrative of heroic resistance nor the narrative of perpetrator guilt. It is simply a story of desperate, amoral survival, and therefore, it is largely unremembered. The physical evidence of this era is not found in Germany, but dispersed across the Atlantic. It sits in living rooms in Ohio and display cases in New York, often misidentified as war trophies rather than survival payments. But to understand the true legacy, one must return to Berlin, to Potsdamer Platz in 2024. Beside the glass towers and the bustling commerce of the rebuilt Grand Hyatt Hotel stands the German Historical Museum. Inside, in case number 47, sits a small, delicate object, a Meissen shepherdess figurine, fired circa 1880. It was donated by the estate of an American collector. The museum placard offers no details about the transaction that brought it across the ocean. It does not mention the freezing winter of 1946, the hunger of a child in a cellar, or the carton of cigarettes that changed hands to save a life. It lists only the object, the date, and 4 words that compress the entire tragedy of a collapsed civilization into a single line of provenance. Acquired in occupied Germany.